Gnostic Church of Christ. We just completed the text from Codex 6 titled Plato, Republic 588a through 589b. And if you look at Codex 6 from the Nag Hammadi library, you'll note that there are a total of 8 texts, of which 4 of those are excerpts or taken from Greek and Egyptian historical documents, texts, influences. And what I want to parse out before we go into the read and commentary of our next text from Codex 6, which is titled The Discourse on the 8th and the 9th, is how important it is that we understand the Nag Hammadi library is a body of different documents or scripts that come from all different or varied backgrounds of understanding, knowledge, wisdom, writings, philosophy, or religion. He is explaining to us our origins and our place in the universe, our purpose from the past, present, and to the future, all oriented around a shared understanding, and that is really 2 main central themes. First being, we are on a journey of descendancy and ascendancy. Essentially, the cornerstone of these different philosophies or religions or ideas or thoughts center around the concept of transformation. And that's the whole point of these scripts, whether they be from Adam, John, or Thomas, or they be from Plato or Hermes Trismegistus. They all center around first idea, and the second being this understanding of human being written into a cosmic story, kind of cosmogony about humans past, present, and to the future, and how they all tie together into our understanding of not only our place in the universe, but our relationship to God, and in some cases, gods. The Orthodox Church would, of course, call that God Jehovah, but in Gnosticism, we refer to that supreme God as the monad, or the true Father. Humanity attains or aspires toward becoming as a god, rising up from the ashes, sort of the phoenix motif, to a higher self, and joining God, whether it be in heaven or in the pleroma or nirvana, if it's in Buddhism, because there's even a streak of Buddhism, other religions that Gnosticism has influenced through time. The central thing that makes the difference between whether or not a person is going to transcend is this idea of what's called gnosis. And the Greeks often would couple that with another prerequisite, and that was the idea of purity, the idea of detaching from desire. And you can hear similar echoing from Asia Minor, which a lot of these thoughts came from Egypt and Asia Minor and bled into southeastern Europe. Buddhism, attaching to desire, being the cornerstone of all suffering. So these themes go through and through, but if we understand Gnosticism, you follow thus far on this channel, or you've been reading the Nag Hammadi library, you understand that the cosmogony or the cosmology of man is such that Gnosticism comes before all of these different philosophies. They in fact feed into these different philosophies, and that's why we are seeing this particular jar found in Egypt in 1945 have many different writings, and even Greek philosophers' writings. And that's what you have. We've already read, of course, Plato, Republic 588a and 589b, which talked about why human might want to follow a just pathway rather than an unjust pathway, even though nobody may be watching him. And of course, the conclusion we came to that was karma. Whatever we reap, we sow. Of course, the analogy of the farmer is being used, much in the way Christ used that same analogy of the farmer. Something, of course, we can relate to, right? As humans, we've been doing farming for thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of years. If we sow something rotten, then of course we're going to reap that same rot into our own life, and that's going to bring about destitution of our farm. And the opposite is true. It has nothing to do with good or bad through the eyes of Gnosticism, but in the eyes of the Greeks, a thin line between you not only had to have gnosis, but you also had to live a pure life, and that was often cherry-picked, just like it is in Orthodox Christianity. What one person did was considered bad, and then, of course, that other person doing something else would say, no, what you're doing is bad, and they just sort of point fingers at each other. And that's, of course, where you get the concept of demagoguery and democracy and all these things that where people are fighting over what's the way to run society, an ethical way, policy way, so forth and so on. I wanted to provide that backdrop so that we understand why we're not just getting quote-unquote Christian or Old Testament kind of writings in the Nag Hammadi library. It really is about serving Gnosis. Whoever brought these various different scripts together into one jar, they were interested in Gnosis and allowing whoever got the jar to make sense of it from their own perspective. But the whole goal was to share the understanding of humankind's origins, where they are now and where they're ultimately going, and the whole idea of transcendancy and how knowledge serves into that. And then we can also include this idea of purity and how we might interpret that. The Greeks might have a more ascetic understanding of that. The Gnostics, maybe different branches of school, might lean more toward an ascetic understanding of that, whereas other branches might be far more liberal about how they understand what that term means exactly, and whether or not they even adhere to that understanding. What we talk about, and at least all Gnostics have in common, is the idea of what's called fullness, or the accomplishment, or fulfilling the seed. That really is ultimately what is going to allow you to spring forth and to reach that kind of fullness and to ultimately transform and ascend. Gnostics would at least agree on that, and to some extent Greeks would as well, and many other Gnostically influenced thoughts. Let's go into 3 different Wikipedia write-ups, and I'm just going to take bits from each one of these because it's important we have this backdrop about this particular write-up that we're getting ready to read and comment about, and that's the Discourse on the 8th and the 9th. And the first of these is, of course, just that backdrop. It, of course, is a ancient Hermetic treatise. It is one of the 3 short texts attributed to the legendary Hellenistic figure Hermes Trismegistus that were discovered among the Nag Hammadi findings. And so, of course, anybody that has an understanding of Hermes and Hellenistic history will be able to resonate with that and say, okay, that makes sense, and I get that. But many of you perhaps don't have that knowledge. And so that's what we're getting ready to share, a little bit of that here, enough that we can at least make sense of this text and why it's found in the Nag Hammadi, and maybe what it's trying to convey to us as a Gnostic. The first, of course, is who is Hermes Trismegistus? He really is a legendary figure, but all we have from him is his writings. But we don't really have any documented case of him actually existing. And in some cases, Greeks and even Egyptians would consider him as a kind of god, sort of the mercurial god, the Virgo or Gemini god of nous, which is knowing, which is the mind, the god of the mind. And in this particular case, he's called Trismegistus because of 2 main reasons. The first being he's considered great for 3 different reasons. At one point being known as a king, a philosopher, I had forgotten the third one, I think a writer. So essentially Trismegistus means thrice greatest. It's hard to know exactly when Hermes was supposed to exist. Some believe around 300-400 BC. Some even have him going back to Noah, and others say no, he came after Christ. It's not clear. He believed God was made up of 3 parts, which of course then if you follow Catholicism, you certainly can resonate with that, the Trinity. Gnostics also have the understanding of kind of a trinity, what we call a tripartite human being, and that of course is we're made up of 3 parts, the spirit, the soul, and the body, the material self. And so you can see how these all interplay. Of course, Gnostics would suggest they all came from Gnosticism, because Gnosticism is the oldest of all the spiritual teachings, going back to Adam and even prior to that. At least that's what we would argue. Others might, of course, argue something different. Now, that's really what you want to know about Hermes. We're not going to go much more deeply into that for the sake of time. But as we continue on this channel, later we might pick up some of his texts, really 3 main ones, the author of Hermetica, Corpus Hermeticum, and a third one, this idea of Hermeticism, which is a philosophy and religious tradition. It's not really a religion as much as a tradition that's rooted in the teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. This, like Gnosticism, is somewhat syncretic and is pulling together many thoughts and ideas from at least the modern understanding of Gnosticism. You can see, of course, that's happening with the Nag Hammadi library. But prior to that, we'd say that Gnosticism is the origin of all true knowledge, or what's called gnosis. Hermes is thought to be a combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. And of course, Egyptian god Thoth is also known as the god of scribe and knowledge. The system encompasses a wide range of esoteric knowledge, including aspects of alchemy, astrology, theurgy, and then, of course, mysticism and occult. Often referred to as Hermetica as being the main producer of that spanned, it was very popular, somewhere between 300 and 1200 CE. Other books, Asclepius and Corpus Hermeticum, or a couple of the other ones that he supposedly had penned. And then there's the Emerald Tablets, which some think he penned. Others argue that Hermes and Thoth were separate. They weren't the same. Others say, no, the Emerald Tablets were written by Thoth. And others say, no, it was Hermes. And others say, no, well, they're the same. So he wrote it. The main thing I want to pull from this is trying to understand and decipher the difference between Hermeticism and Gnosticism. Because I think this is so key, because many people often don't really understand Gnosticism, confuse Gnosticism with being something to do with Freemasonry or the Illuminati or Hermeticism or magic or OTT or Theosophy, so forth and so on. They just sort of confuse it, and some even think it's Luciferianism and Satanism. Of course, we've done videos on that, and we clarify how clearly they're opposite of that. Some of the key understandings of how to differentiate between Hermeticism and Gnosticism. They, of course, share some similar themes as we learned from Plato, this idea of the forms and the perfect form, the ideal form, and then the material form, which is a mock-up of the original form, and the idea of humans descended into a body, but Greeks would really center around the soul being the ideal form, whereas Gnostics would center around the spirit being the ideal form, and the soul being a kind of intermediary between the body, the material self, and the spirit. And that's one of the things we differentiate between. The other thing is this idea of gnosis is not that commonly used among Greeks, although they do use that, but it's not as central as the idea of what's called nous, which the soul and the mind, it's really called the mind. It's where the seed of intellect lies. Now, in Gnosticism, we also have what's called nous, and that is what's known as the companion to Christ when Christ was emanated from Barbello, which is the mother part, that emanated and brought forth, because that's what she requested from the Father. She wanted a Christ, and so that was given to her and was emanated. So the Christ was emanated, and the Christ then asked for a gift from the mother. The mother said, well, what is it you want? And he says, well, I want nous. And the reason he wanted nous is because he foresaw he was going to come to humanity and send forth the message of the pleroma and the true Father. And human, of course, had been completely blinded, misled about this idea of the Old Testament God, the demiurge, being the true God, which in that case really was the false God. So he wanted nous because in order for his message to be received, man would have to have a mind. They would have to be able to receive it. And so that was the whole idea. So nous, you can kind of think of it being the soul. But it really is not the soul. It is the highest part. It really is the intermediary between what's called the logos of this universe and the logos of Christ. So it sits between those two. It allows for man to break out of the logos of the kanoma when he hears Christ's message, to then leap above this realm. Not in a hierarchical sense, but in a knowledge, value, qualitative sense. And then that opens them up to the higher realms. And that's the whole idea of the nous. Now, in Hermetic philosophy, they also have what's called the nous, and they have what's called the creator and the all and the one. And God is both all and the creator of the all. All created things pre-exist because of the God. God's the nature of the cosmos. And so they tend to intertwine the idea of God into the cosmos. The cosmos is a kind of God, and even they reverence planets, and some people even believe the planets were a kind of God at that point, worshipped. Or even religions that came out of Greece, they literally worshipped sun kings and worshipped the sun. In Gnosticism, we believe this realm, the kanoma, the stars and the planets, although they have gnosis running in them, everything that is in this universe has gnosis. Light and gnosis are really the same thing. Without gnosis, nothing would run. It's knowledge that causes everything to be in motion and to find rest and not to be just dead matter. Darkness and ignorance is what leads to death and is the source of all death. That's how Gnostics would understand the relationship between those two. So we differ in that we see the true Father-Mother is in the self-same time outside of this realm, but yet its essence is emanated into this realm. And its essence is necessarily emanated into this realm in order to keep this realm going. Without that essence, this realm would collapse and wouldn't just fold out and just be darkness and would not exist. Darkness basically being nothing. They also believe in the idea of transcendence and immanent as the creator of cosmos. These ideas are closely related to cosmo-theological views of the Stoics, and that's another difference the Gnostics hold. The Stoics tend to be very ascetic, idea of leading a very pure life, devoid of desire. This, of course, is very similar to Buddhism as well. Then there's the idea of materia, a key concept of alchemical tradition, representing the raw, undifferentiated substance from which all things originated. You can see that word material. And we're, of course, talking about this cosmos. This is how we differ as well from most of the Greeks at that time, and particularly the Hermeticists, in that they did practice magic and they really, although we do believe in knowledge of astrology and all these things, we see them as the work of binding of this realm, whereas they can be used as a type of ascendancy because it brings forth knowledge. But our goal is to transcend that, whereas Hermeticism, the idea of this realm being created from material substance, is very different. We see that everything is emanated from what's called the essence of the Mother Father, the pure essence, which we call just Spirit, or the Holy Spirit, to the fullness, brings about all things. Anomaly that was brought about by Sophia, not understanding her worthiness to receive the true Father that loved her and saw her as equal to him, she brought about an anomaly that then degraded that essence down to something substantial that is called material form. And you can see how Hermeticism focuses on this idea of squeezing all the knowledge out of the material, which Gnostics do as well, but the difference being Hermetics would perhaps reverence the material realm, almost like I said before, some even worshiping the sun and the various planets, whereas Gnostics would do the very opposite. We think about Thomas, where he talks about that if you really see this realm for what it is, you recognize this realm is but corpse, dried up bones in a corpse, and that this realm is not worthy of you. And so we would almost see this realm as not necessarily less than us, but just a set of experience we're having. Isn't necessarily what we would consider the most transcendental experience to have, but it's a necessary one to have because of the anomaly. We're going about to essentially gain our worthiness to receive God's love, basically, is what we have, through the feminine, the weakened form. And this is represented through the physical metaphor. I say that it's a physical metaphor because the real essence is the spirit. Everything is just substantial or a substance to that. Well, of course, Hermeticists would believe in the prima materia, which is the primary material. And I could go on, but right there you can already see there's a number of differences, quite a few, and you can read through this if you want. Now, they have this idea of the seven heavens, and they really focus on the material realm quite a bit. And this idea, even when we get to the higher realms, we are kind of rewarded by, you can have this image of the gods up in the heavens with their pristine floors and white clouds and, white raiment, and they're eating grapes and people are fanning them. So it's almost sense-oriented. It's an interesting way of trying to parse out the difference between desire versus pleasure. And then you have that similar theme with Orthodox Christianity as well. This idea of heaven and there's harps and nobody's crying and everybody's eating all this food, but yet pleasure is kind of looked down on by Orthodox Christianity, desire, right? Gnostic Christians would not necessarily say that desire is a bad thing. It's more about how is it that we balance between the left and the right hand knowledge. The dark knowledge versus the light knowledge. We see this as a necessary component of the evolution, of the ascendancy, to rectify or redeem the anomaly. And it's not looked down on, it's not castigated or belittled, but rather it's reverenced in that it speaks of free will that the father or mother allowed from the beginning, and how Sophia wanted to experience the wisdom of the father. She wanted to become, not just to be the father, like she didn't want to just be told, you are equal to me, but she wanted to earn that. She wanted to really understand that from the depths of her essence. And so in order for her to really fully grasp that, she would have to have the full experience, which would be to go from utter emptiness and to eventually ascend to complete fullness. And that would give her all the wisdom that she would ever be able to ascertain, to be able to fully appreciate that she could truly be loved by someone so awesome. Really is the essence of what we're experiencing here. So we don't look at it as something bad. We don't look at it as a fall. We call it an anomaly. That's simply what we call it. We just call it an anomaly. But everybody's free will is an anomaly, because each one of us are a unique outcome. And that's why we're here, to present a unique outcome and to bring it back to the pleroma and make it that much more, and make this realm that much more, and to liberate this realm. That's the whole goal. So hopefully I've clarified the central differences between Hermeticism and Gnosticism. Now, having said that, there is a lot of similarities when it comes to things that are much less quintessential, the central or fundamental concepts. But when we think about sort of the peripheral, less fundamental concepts, there's a lot of similarities between Hermeticism and Gnosticism. For example, many Gnostics study astrology or tarot or alchemy. These are many good examples. Definitely we believe in this idea of the importance of knowledge in all of its forms. And much of science and mathematics came out of the appreciation for and the paradigm of understanding of our cosmology and place in the universe in relationship to God because of it. Many of the Orthodox Christians would argue much of the science came out of that, but the reality is, from my perspective, if you go back historically, they really came out of Gnosticism. Much of Orthodox Christianity would downcast the idea of knowledge, so much as not allowing churchgoers to read. And only the Holy Fathers were permitted to read. Women weren't allowed to ascertain education for thousands of years. Really what I want us to understand about the backdrop. Now, getting into the actual text, I brought forth this idea of nous, and that's a very central theme in this book, the Discourse of the 8th and 9th. And when we talk about the Discourse of the 8th and 9th, we're going to talk about the nous, we're going to talk about what is the 8th and 9th. What are we talking about here? Nous, first off, is, as we talked about before, the mind. But you can see how that word is very similar to knowledge and gnosis, because they all stem from a similar term. My own inspired study has led me to believe it comes from a similar word that we get the word no, N-O, meaning no, because everything is a rejection. We had this talk before about another text that we read and commented on this channel. We talked about the importance of why Gnostics are at the core rebels and rebellious. And all things of progress and knowledge stem from rebellion. Nothing came from conformity. And formity, you see the similarity here. This idea, whether the right-hand path or left-hand path are going to try to get you to conform. The whole idea is to say no. And the reason you say no is the only time you say no to something is when you have a clarity about something you're being presented that is opposite to what you know to be true, what you believe to be true for you. And that's why you say no. This idea of nous is that ability, mind's ability to be open to progress, transcendency, free will, and it's a way to say no. And the same thing with gnosis and knowledge. They all come from that same. And why? It's the confronting. It's that moment of bringing forth that new light that never existed before until you came along, and you're presenting a no. And from no comes the potential for creation or emanation, something new. This is the whole idea. Now, why is that then significant to the 8th and 9th realm? Because in the Greeks, they really essentially believed in only what's called the 7 realms. And the 7 realms were represented by the 7 planets. And there was this idea of the 8th planet coming along with Judaism, which is the Sabbath or Saturn, when that they worship the Sabbath, and that's the 8th planet, which is the planet of laws and limitation, judges, judicial, Jews, and jewelry and money, and how that then governs humanity from when that started to become the core central theme of humanity in the Middle East and begin to dominate the paradigm of man's thinking. So the eighth and ninth realm comes along. It represents planets that are yet to show up but are the beginning to arrive in the psyche of humanity. And this idea that there is an eighth and ninth planet from the standpoint of the Greeks existed at that point. And they believed they were called the higher realms. Now, the eighth realm, in this case they called it the Ogdog. I'm sorry, I don't remember the term for the ninth realm, but it's similar. It's something dog. The eighth realm was realm where the souls went, what I call, in Gnosticism, we call the Holy Souls realm. Then the ninth realm is where the gods were. Okay, that was even higher, and you could perhaps even transcend to that realm and then worship among the gods. The difference between Hermeticism, the Greeks, about how they saw the eighth and ninth realm versus how Gnostics view the eighth and ninth realm is we look at the eighth and ninth realm as literal parallel kind of universes. They're not planets. But instead, what's called the luminaries are emanated from the higher realms as an embodiment of the motif, the metaphor, or the metaphysical impression into this realm through that particular planet. In this case, the eighth realm would probably be Uranus, and then the ninth realm probably Neptune, for example. If you count in astronomy, you'd say, well, no, the eighth and ninth planet are Neptune and Pluto. But this is astrology, which is a different counting system, because they do include the moon and the sun, but they don't include the earth. And in that time, they believe it was geocentric in how they saw the way the universe was structured. Everything went around the earth, including the sun and the moon and all the planets and that. But in Gnosticism, we understand the eighth and ninth realm to be beyond this realm. Now, it could be other galaxies, it could be beyond the Milky Way. We don't know, but it's beyond this solar system. But they are embodied through these planets and how these planets then influence humans on Earth. And that's what you want to understand. So it's not really important whether you look at it one way or the other. What's more important is, what is this discourse around the eighth and ninth? Really, it's about how a mystic guides a tutorage for a apprentice of sorts that is wanting to get initiated into this doctrine. Well, at that time, they considered it sacred, and you had to be initiated, and it was only certain people picked to be able to get into the sects, the secret sects of the Hermetic schools of thought, and you had to be initiated. And, of course, the goal was to get your soul to transcend through these higher realms. And there was arguments about whether that happened during this lifetime, based upon if you lived a stoic, pure, quote-unquote, pure life, or other more liberal ideas of that, no, it's not really about whether you're pure in this life. It's more about nous. That's another way of saying gnosis for us, or the mind, how much you tune into the mind. You live a higher self. And that transcendency more happens in the afterlife. And that's unimportant, really, but it's something you just want to understand, that they also had different sects of thought around this idea. And this is what this whole discourse is about, going through a whole process of how to achieve transcendency beyond the seven realms and going into the eighth and ninth realms. And of course, we would call that being the Holy Souls realm, and then the ninth realm, even beyond that, would be the first realm, the stepping into what's known as the realm of the pleroma. All right, now, what we believe is most people, presuming that they find fullness, meaning they complete their mission here, or their task, or their accomplishment, and they follow their inner voice, and they say no to pressure to conform, and they stick to their path through gnosis, then they transcend, and in the afterlife they go to the eighth realm. In Gnostics, we generally understand the eighth realm to be a realm where people generally live to be around 1,000 years. And we're a lot more resilient, there's a lot less suffering and pain. What we dwell on is a lot less petty. Things like physical war, things about material things become less significant to us. And you're only going to be able to get into that realm if you have been able to understand the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. What does that mean? Well, there's all kinds of videos we've done on that, but I'll continue to explicate on that. But in a very brief way, again, it is you understand enough about how the demiurge tries to conform you and bring you back to this realm, and that you don't allow either the right side, which is all the religions in the world, the mothers and the fathers and the priests and all of the peers, they're all trying to pressure you to be something you're not on the right-hand path. The left-hand path is all of the luster of this world, going to take you off that course. By that, we're saying not that pleasure is a bad thing. Again, it's moderation and balancing between these two. You want some degree of disciplining of the will, but you don't want to discipline the will to the point you extinguish it, because it's human nature to have desires. It's human nature to have pleasure. Part of the reward system that allows you to be able to accomplish that task. And so it isn't something is frowned on by Gnostics. That left-hand path, though, if taken to extreme, is things like where you allow the lust and cares of this world to overtake you. Whether it's a lust for power, whether it's a lust for sex, or a lust for fame, or a lust for whatever it happens to be, that's going to completely throw you off of the course, and you have no discipline of the will. What the right-hand path does, it basically kills the will, because it strangles it, trying to force it into submission to the point, it uses discipline to the point that it becomes authoritarianism, tyrannical, and literally deadens the spirit. What the left-hand path does, it totally destroys any disciplining whatsoever. And a person goes, it happens to do, overdoes it to the point it literally almost kills the physical body. Doesn't allow that person enough time then to accomplish its task. So it has to just come back. So that's what you want to understand. I'm giving that backdrop because we're going to get an account of how Hermetics understood how this process works. And that's what you want to understand. As we're reading this, we're not reading so much what Gnostics believed as much as what Hermetics believed. And why this is included is because it's very similar and allows the reader to decide for themselves. Now, I'm just giving you what I understand, what we've read up to now. Most of the text of Gnosticism is leaning more toward Christian thought or Buddhism. But you can obviously see how Hermeticism was also influenced by perhaps both Gnosticism and Buddhist thought, or even Hinduism, for example, or Egyptian thought, or even Christianity at some point, eventually. But that came later, or we could say Judaism. Everybody just basically influenced everybody else. But the go here is to give you another snapshot of how Gnosis plays itself out through different tribes and people living in various different parts of Asia Minor at that time. Okay, so with that, I know it's very extensive, but it's a very important backdrop in context to provide. So we don't get confused about why this is in the Nag Hammadi. And we're getting another representation of the way Hermetics, or the Greeks, some of the Greeks at the time, understood transcendency from this realm. I'm reading from the Marvin Mayer and Willis Barstone translation. And they do have a archive note here. It says the Nag Hammadi collection includes a previously unknown and crucially important Hermetic document, Discourse on the 8th and 9th, probably dating to the 2nd or 3rd century. The text appears to be an initiation rite into a visionary journey. This document provides singular evidence of the liturgical and experiential elements within Hermetic tradition. It gives witness to the existence of a ritual genera of Hermetic writings previously unknown and now lost. The ritual vows, phrases shown in the text are meditational vocalizations based on the sacred name Yao. Yao is similar to Yahweh, and also it's similar to the word yes. So I just pointed that out because I think it's going to be important for us to understand that. Now, let's go into this particular text. And we'll just read a little bit because I've provided a very extensive backdrop, and we're probably well into 30 minutes at this point. So the Discourse on the 8th and 9th. So it's written here, quote, my father, we are speculating that Hermes and some of his apprentices are talking. Quote, my father, yesterday you promised me you would take my mind to the 8th heavenly sphere, and after that you would take me to the 9th. You said this is the sequence of the tradition. And so this is obviously a student that his instructor or teacher had said that, I'm going to teach you tomorrow about the 8th and 9th realm. And so he's coming back and saying, hey, so tell me about this. Quote, yes, my child, this is the sequence, but the promise was made among human nature. So in other words, I know I promised you that, but, I'm a human. I said to you when I first made the promise, if you remember each of the stages, after I received the Spirit through the power, I established the action for you. So in other words, he wants his student to contemplate on this, not just come for him and spoon feed him. Clearly understanding dwells within you. In me, it is as if the power were pregnant. For when I conceived from the spring that flows to me, I gave birth. So he's already teaching him right away. He's saying this truth is in you, and that all you need to do is bring it forth. This is basically what he's saying. He says, I brought it forth, you can do it as well. That's the essence of what I'm taking from this paragraph. So, Father, you have spoken every word rightly to me, but I am amazed at what you say. You said, the power in me? So in other words, he's saying, you're saying, I have this knowledge too and this power? He said, I gave birth to it as children are born. And so it says, I gave birth to it as children are born. So he's saying that I gave birth to it. So he's, in other words, saying, well, you're human too, so you can give birth to it as well. Then, Father, I have many siblings if I am to be counted among the generations. This is a moment the student light bulb comes on and says, so in other words, you're saying everybody kind of has this. If that's true, then I've got a lot of siblings. I've got a lot of brothers and sisters. Right, child, this good thing is counted. Always. So, child, you must know your siblings, honor them rightly, since they have come from the very same Father. So you can see how this is similar to Gnosticism, right? We're all coming from that true Father, right? We're sisters and brothers, all coming here. For each of the generations have I addressed. I have named them, since they are offspring like these children. Then, Father, do they have a day? Child, they are spiritual, for they exist as forces that nurture other souls. That is why I say they are immortal. So in other words, do they die? That's what he's asking the student, saying, do they have a day? In other words, saying, do they die at some point? Or the teacher is saying, they are spiritual, and they have souls. So they're going to live forever. The student accepts it. He says, your word is true. From now on, it cannot be refuted. Father, begin the discourse on the 8th and the 9th, and count me also with my siblings. The student is very receptive. He's open-minded, and he accepts it seems like he really respects this teacher. Like, whatever this teacher says, he pretty much has gathered at this point. The teacher is very wise, and that he trusts the teacher. The teacher says, let us pray, child, to the Father of the universe, with your siblings, who are my children, that the Father may grant the spirit of eloquence. How do they pray, Father, when they are united with the generations? Father, I want to obey. So what does it mean here? How do they pray when they are united with the generation? When we're talking about generation, it comes to mind how humans come about. We come about through generation. We come about through the generative process, which is smacking back to Genesis. So in other words, we come through the DNA. And so he's saying we're physical bodies. And so we're going to pray the way we think we should pray. So the student wants to know, how do we pray the way a spiritual person or soul-oriented person would pray? That's essentially what he's saying here. So you can see how we're getting some of the philosophy just by the way they're speaking to each other, that the Hermetics, at least from this understanding, the Hermetics had at that point. And I'll just read a couple more and we'll close. ... It is right for you to remember the progress you have experienced as wisdom in the books. Child, recall your early childhood. You have posed, as children do, senseless and foolish questions. So here he's basically saying you have it in you again. Like it's sort of like a subtle way of saying I have confidence in you. It sounds like a backhanded kind of like insult. You're asking a foolish question. But he's really encouraging him to think. And he's saying, you've got this answer in you already. So you don't need to ask me every little thing. Father, I have experienced progress and foreknowledge from the books, and they are greater than what is lacking. These matters are my first concern. So he's saying, he's taking responsibility. He says, you're right. I was supposed to read these books. I've read them. If I just search in, I'm going to know. Despite my lacking, I will make it important. I will make it my first concern to make sure that I seek out I meditate on finding my truth rather than, coming to you to answer everything. Child, when you understand the truth of your statement, you will find your siblings, who are my children, praying with you. So again, just like Gnosticism, we keep pointing back to this idea that every time Gnosticism, when it says, well, who am I exactly? And, what did God want from me? Keep pointing back to self. God wants what's within you to come forth. So same thing here. This particular Hermetic teacher keeps encouraging the child to go within and find their truth. And when they've done that, then they would become one of the brothers or sisters among all the other brothers and sisters that have found their way to transcendency. And this is where we're going to leave it for now. And so we'll pick back up in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. And until next time, have a blessed day.